Okay, well, this is Karissa Pudder for the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program. I'm here with Dr. Steve Noll. We're in Keene Flint Hall. Today is June 30th, 2025, about 10 a.m., I believe. So yeah, thank you for meeting with me again. This is a follow-up. We get to revisit
same
some
stuff.
new things. Yeah, or even some new stuff.
Maybe so.
Yeah.
Okay.
But all right, well, let's start with the basics just to get warmed up. So can you tell me when and where you were born?
No.
Thank you for that.
Okay. July 1st, 1952, so birthday tomorrow.
Happy birthday.
St. John's Hospital, Brooklyn, New York.
All right. We talked a little bit about your childhood before, but maybe we can talk a little more about any times that you've revisited recently. How do you feel that your home has changed? Like, what's different about it, but what's the
I
same?
was there with my son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter this past January. I went up there for the AHA, the American Historical Association meeting in New York, and spent some time on Long Island. Went by the house. Neighborhood is very similar to what it was when I was there, which is interesting. Stores are there still, but not the kinds of stores that were there when I grew up. We had grocery stores and liquor stores and delicatessens and drug stores and 5 and 10s, all of which were mom and pop stores. None of those are there except for one deli, but the stores are there. People can walk to them still. So the neighborhood looks very similar to what it was when I was there. Houses are ridiculously expensive now, so I don't know if a person who is a school teacher or whatever could afford to buy those now, but that's kind of where it is. I think it's still pretty segregated, so interesting.
Can you talk a little more about that when you mean segregated?
Suburbs, post-World War II, white only, written in the deed of the house that, when my parents died, found the deed, and the covenant was, word was Caucasians only. And that's kind of, it was a great place to grow up, but it was unspoken that it was a great place to grow up if you were white. Interesting, we had a Puerto Rican family living on our block for a while who were, no one bothered them because Puerto Rican is not black, but and interesting that the house got sold to a white family who were from rural Virginia maybe, and people interestingly commented, oh, those Puerto Ricans are better than these white slobs, which I thought was pretty interesting. So, and it tells you that a lot of their preconceived notions are about larger groups as opposed to individual families.
Interesting. And that's also, it's interesting that you say that. So, when thinking about a lot of those differences, as a child, was it something that was pretty evident to you, or was it something did you reflect more on it in adulthood?
No. It was a natural part of life. You didn't worry about it. You didn't think about it. Black people didn't exist. We were. My elementary school, there were no black people. My high school, there were no black people. They just were somewhere else. So no, it was just something that running track in high school, came across schools that were integrated, but also schools that were primarily African American. Places like Roosevelt, which is where Eddie Murphy grew up, which is where Julius Erving, the basketball player, grew up, and everybody knew that that's where black people lived. And Hempstead, which is, again, moving slowly towards becoming considerably black during my childhood. Everybody knew black people lived there.
Interesting. Thank you for that. And touching maybe more on your childhood, I wanted to ask a little more about your grandmother, because you mentioned before that she lived with you.
Yeah, my grandmother, born in 1896, got married in 1917. I had my mother a year later. Her husband was a professional baseball player who played 7 years minor league ball, made probably more money doing that than, actually then played semi-pro ball around New York and made more money doing that than playing in the South. And he died in 1948, 1949. My parents had just bought the house, and she moved in with us. So she lived with me from before I was born until I moved out of the house. She lived upstairs. And so we had kind of she didn't have her own entrance. She just, lived there. And I thought she was an old lady. She moved there in her 50s, got a job at Adelphi College, now Adelphi University, working in the cafeteria. And she worked there from 1950 to 1976. She was 80 years old. She worked there, and so she was great. I had a built-in babysitter. She was wonderful. So it was a good situation.
And I guess more about her, like, being a part of the dynamic of your upbringing. Are there any memories that kind of stand out in mind, or like maybe lasting lessons that have stuck out with you that you learned from her growing up with her?
Just have fun. She was and also a very independent woman. Bought her own car when her husband was playing ball in the South. He came back and she had a car. I don't know how the hell she did that. She basically bought the house that she lived in. But then when her husband died, she said, I don't want to live alone. So she moved to our house with my uncle, who was, extended family, not really my uncle, that. And so he lived upstairs with her until he got married, maybe 1955. So I was 3. So I remember him, and she lived in a bed. She had this wonderful apartment upstairs. It's a gigantic kitchen / sewing room. And she was a seamstress too, so she made a lot of money on the side, fixing people's dresses and fixing people's coats and sewing stuff for me. And then she had one bedroom, and then she had a living room, and my uncle lived on the couch in the living room. So then he moved out when he got married. So it was a, and they brought the dog too. So it was a very kind of nice situation. And what lessons did I learn? Family's important.
You said you learned from her to just have fun. Was that something that kind of stood out about her personality?
Oh yeah, I mean, she was just a great humorous woman who had an enjoyable time all the time. So she was quite the character, and even especially when I was in college and people would come to New York and stay at the house. Oh my God, Tilly, she's just great. So it was very nice. And when evenings, the TV was upstairs in her rooms, in her living rooms. We'd go up there, and then we would have cheese and crackers, me and her. So it was. And I was an only child, so I was the grandchild. So she was. It was a nice time.
Cool. Thank you for that. And I'd also like to ask a little more about your father. So you've talked a little about how he was a veteran of World War II.
Yeah, only child. Grew up in Woodhaven, close to the Trump stuff. Only child as well. Lived in a house there. Went to Brooklyn Tech, which was a prestigious New York high school. We graduated from there, and then got a 2-year degree from Pratt Institute in New York in electrical engineering, and got a job at a machine shop in Brooklyn where he worked. Was drafted in 1940 before the war started. FDR implemented the draft, instituted the draft before the war started. So he was drafted, placed in the 27th Infantry. They had significant training in Louisiana, and then when the war started, ended up in Hawaii. and which he really liked, and was a ranger in the Army. And not only was a ranger, he was a ranger instructor. So he was teaching other people how to do the kinds of ranger things, particularly, how to use all sorts of weapons, but especially how to use your own weapons. So a knife, hands, fists, legs, whatever. So then when they started to island hop to capture islands in the Pacific, 27th was sent to Anawita, where he was wounded in the arm, got a Purple Heart for that, but didn't, just okay. Then they went to Saipan in 1944, basically the same time as D-Day, and landed there. And he was wounded there, lost his leg, got a Bronze Star for bringing back 6 wounded people under Japanese fire. I always thought that was kind of a cheap-ass thing to give him, because I thought I'd look at what people get for Congressional Medals of Honor. And I think it had a lot to do with inter-service rivalry, because the 27th Infantry was not doing what the head of the invasion force, who was a Marine general, thought they should have. So they sent in Marines to supposedly help the Army capture them, and very different ways of fighting. And my father rarely talked about the war, but talked about how, one thing he talked about was, if there was a Japanese foxhole, the Marines would go in there charging like tough-ass Marines and get shot. He said, shit, we would go in there with a flamethrower first. We wouldn't deal with, so I don't want to die, And so if it took a little longer, that's okay. There was less casualties, and it didn't. And there's still controversy over the inter-service battle between Army and Marines over what happened on Saipan. And I think he understood that. So ended up going back to Hawaii, where for recovery and rehabilitation, and was sent to Atlanta, where he was in the Army hospital in Atlanta, which, interestingly enough, is maybe a mile away from where my son lives now. And then he went back to New York to live his life with one leg, with a wooden prosthesis supplied by the VA. Had to get a Pontiac car, because Pontiacs were the only car at that point that were made, except for Cadillacs, that were made with automatic transmission, because he could not use a standard with a clutch, because he couldn't feel that with his leg. Married my mother in 1947. Their parents kind of knew each other, not really, but friends of friends. And when my father came home from the war, they said, well, this guy's coming back. He's lost his leg, maybe needs someone to write to. And my mother had been, I don't know if engaged is the correct word, but involved with a soldier who, I don't know the story, either died or dumped her, So she didn't have anybody. He was born in 1914. She was born in 1918. So they started writing, and they lived fairly close to each other. And within a year, they got married. And so they lived for a year at my father's house in Woodhaven. And he got his old job back, which he lasted until 1976. And my mother actually had a pretty good job working in an office in Manhattan. And she worked there until I was born, and then she didn't work again, because women didn't work. She didn't work until I went to junior high school, and then she got a job as a children's librarian in the local public library.
All right, a lot to delve into there. So you talk about your father losing his leg in the war, and then he comes back. They never
found it either.
That's very unfortunate.
Okay, yeah, it is. Yeah.
It is.
Maybe someone else did, so then he had 3 legs. I don't know.
We'll never know.
Never know.
But with his experience then becoming an amputee and then going back into the workforce, Were there any challenges that you noticed during your childhood that he faced that may have been
not at
different
work.
than to others?
Not at work. I think everyone was, no, I mean, because he worked in a machine shop as an armature winder, which you have no idea what the hell that is.
I do now.
Well, I didn't tell you what it is.
Yes, you did.
Or I did the first time. Okay, all right, so he worked there.
But if you'd like, would you like to talk about it again?
He rewound ship's motors at a machine shop close to the docks in Brooklyn. So, I mean, there were no concerns there. Concerns maybe, so he would drive to the train and then take the train in. The only time there was a problem was when it was a lot of snow and couldn't drive. And then we could walk to the train, but it was tough to do that, so I would have to walk with him to make sure everything was okay. And then the same thing coming back. And then when if that was a case, if I was in high school driving and picking him up. But I think pretty early I learned that he was different than other people and that his leg was gone. I mean, I learned pretty quickly the difference between a sock and a stump sock because he had to put a stock on because his leg was amputated below the knee, so we had to put a stump sock on there. And oftentimes I would take the stump sock and put it in the laundry, and it would sometimes be drops of blood on there from rubbing. But my job was to, he couldn't shower because he couldn't stand up in the shower on his one leg, so we had a bathtub. So my job, from as long as I can remember, was to take because he undressed in the bedroom and hopped to the shower and did that. My job was to take the leg and bring it into him. So I mean, it was totally normal. It's just, in fact, it was so normal that I don't know how old maybe 5, 4. I'm telling him, well, I don't want to be a father.
Why?
Because fathers have to lose their legs. So it was just so normalized that, I thought everybody's father, this is my father. Adults didn't wear shorts, so I just assumed everybody, when they got married, they chopped off your leg. So, that was, and, my mother was just great. She just, washed all that stuff all the time and did that. And I really think that she normalized him completely. She just, if she made him make sure that everything was okay and that, you were not disabled, whatever, so she was amazing with him.
Awesome. So I guess connecting that maybe to some of the work that you do now, because you study disability history, you teach disability history.
Yeah.
How did maybe having that as a part of your childhood?
I've thought a lot about,
that
why, and when you look at people who teach disability history, they don't just come upon this, there's usually some sort of connection, personal. And I used to say that it was my next door neighbor who was born with Down syndrome in 1957, and his older brothers were my good friends growing up, and I'm still in touch with one of them. They didn't institutionalize him. They kept him there, and for Down syndrome, young man, he was pretty involved. Today, those images of Down syndrome people working at Publix. Well, George was not a Publix worker, but he was, part of the family, and he would go to sleepaway camp every summer. First, he would go to day camp, which is where I ended up working for 5 years. But then they sent him to sleepaway camp, and every summer my grandmother would be the person sewing his name tags into all his clothing. So we were pretty close with him. We never babysat for him. They didn't go out very much, and the neighbors on the other side were pretty nasty because George would wander around the backyard and his backyard and kind of and the neighbor on the other side didn't like that. Just a redneck jerk. But we were. So I thought that was the reason that I got into this, because that's how I got my first job, working with people with disabilities. But certainly the notion of my father with disabilities as well. I think maybe kind of tied me into that. And then thinking that, I was a preemie, real preemie, weighed 2 pounds, 13 ounces, which is pretty light. And, the doctor told my mother that, only survived because had good lungs, so it was screaming. So that kind of ties into this. But certainly notions of premature birth and their relationship to disability maybe ties into that. And that was a tough pregnancy for my mother, and and at that time, she was smoking, which basically everybody did. So in fact, she smoked till 1964 when the Surgeon General's report came out about smoking, and she quit like that. I mean, the next day. I mean, she just stopped, which is just amazing, just amazing. But, on my birth, I was in the hospital for God knows how long. I wish I knew how long and, what that experience was like for her, but I wasn't smart like you guys and interviewed her. My grandfather, on my father's side, said, don't get too attached to him because he's going to die. So my mother certainly held that against him pretty much. So maybe those three things growing up kind of tied into the notions of disability history stuff. And certainly then when I came to Gainesville and got my master's in special ed and started teaching it, as I majored in history as an undergrad, but that was not disability history, it was foreign policy. Then I kind of, going to grad school in history here, kind of put the disability stuff together with the history stuff and got to disability history.
Cool. You kind of managed to answer a question that I was going to ask.
Okay.
But before
I can read that.
No, you can't.
Oh, okay.
Don't tease me. Before I move on to what I was going to talk about next, can you, do you remember the names of the camps? Because you mentioned a day camp and a summer, a sleepaway camp.
Yeah. Yes.
What were the names?
Oh, see, you have to ask me the correct question. Do you remember the names? Yes, I do. The day camp was AHRC Day Camp in Nassau County, which stands for Association for the Help of Retarded Children. I mean, unbelievably infantilizing those people, and also that they need help, But it was great. And the sleepaway camp was run by them in Hunter, New York, and it's called Camp Loyaltown. And it was originally a camp for underprivileged Jewish kids from New York City, where they would take them and try to get them out of the horrific heat of the summer in New York City and go up there. And then after the war, that idea kind of died, and the AHRC bought the camp, and so now that's still running. The day camp is no longer running. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, so you started mentioning more of your work at UF, like starting your master's.
Uh-huh.
I guess I want to ask about your first impressions of Gainesville. When you first arrived, you were starting as a master's student.
Okay.
Can you paint a picture of me what Gainesville was like at that time?
First of all, I came down here with another guy I ran with at William & Mary, and he was involved with the track club, and I was kind of on the edges of that, so we had some kind of personal connections. First night we stayed in Vizcaya, which is still around on 34th Street, across from the golf course, and we ended up in a trailer, which was obtained for us by Jimmy Carnes, who is the former UF track coach and the guy associated with the Florida Track Club, a trailer in Castlegate, which is out past 75, off of Tower Road. And Gainesville was a small place. We shopped at Pick and Save, which is now where Hobby Lobby is. There wasn't much between where we were and the university. So Newberry Road, there wasn't much on there. University was a smaller place, library see computer science building and the science library weren't there. That was a huge dirt lot. West was there, and I didn't have much money, so I didn't feel like getting a parking sticker, and I didn't have my bike at that point yet. So I parked at the track every day and walked across campus from the track to Norman Hall, so I got a good view of the whole campus. The hub was the hub, it was the center of campus stuff. So that was, that's where you paid your fees. That's where the bookstore was. The Union was smaller. Norman Hall was basically the old P.K. Young High School. So the library in there was basically the size of this room. And it probably had less books in this room because it was the old high school library. So it was a smaller place. A lot of interesting places to drink and things like that. Dubs, which is kind of a bar bizarrely, it's now right near where the Social Security office is. So all those people who were at Dubs are now there. Petty's band played there periodically. The Red Lion, which was kind of the watering hole for Thursday night, track people went there. And lots of, like across here, across University Avenue, all those bars were not there. In fact, one of the places was this restaurant called New Harvest, which is a funky vegetarian restaurant, where they played kind of folk music and lots of, kind of bar type places where music of the 70s were played. And the Great Southern, which was the old theater downtown, had been turned into a venue for semi-large groups of singers, whatever, musical bands type thing, and for $3 or $5 you could go and hear great music. It was an interesting time for sure, and people that I hung out with were mostly people from the track club and the track club at this point was nationally known, so lots of well-known people here. So it was a good time to be here, and my program in special ed was good, and I got to intern at Sidney Lanier, and then got the job there and started teaching.
Cool. Can you tell me a little more about student life here at UF at that time?
Well, as a grad student who lived off campus, I wasn't so involved. I didn't know what the dorms were like. I didn't hang with the undergrads or the frat life or anything else. The interesting thing was, we were fall first year, the damn homecoming parade. We got off for homecoming. That was just crazy. What the hell? William and Mary, it was Saturday morning. The parade was like 4 people, But the crazy thing was, and it's so different now, all the sororities and fraternities would spend because it was on a Friday, so we had off from school. Thursday night, I walk around campus and they're all building these amazing floats, with flowers and all this other stuff. And so it was a big deal. Today, these jokers walk down the street and throw candy at people, and there's no effort at all. So that was kind of strange. So, student life, went to a couple football games. It was hot as hell. And just about the time when students were removing themselves from wearing the ties to games and all that stuff. So, It was a time that people were beginning to change away from the overt control of the university towards students. So dorms are becoming open. Those types of things. There was lots of free concerts. So I must have seen Petty 3 times free, Jimmy Buffett like 5 times free, in all sorts of places, at Flavette, over there by the law school, behind where Broward Hall is now, where they got the new dorms. So free concerts all over the place, which, and then even when the O-Dome was built, which was 19 1980. The concerts there were pretty amazing.
Interesting. Were there any shows that you went to at the O-Dome after it opened?
Yeah, oh yeah. I saw Dylan there. I saw Petty there a couple times, Jimmy Buffett. I saw Poco, which, if anyone knows, it's like my favorite group of all time. So Dan Fogelberg, lots of groups. So it was, sound wasn't great, but it's okay. And again, how much? $10, $20, And they had huge concerts at Florida Field too. And I was huge. They had Neil Young, Bob Dylan, the Eagles, maybe 75, but I was working at the camp. It was like just maybe in June, just as I was heading back north. So, and later on, maybe late 80s, early 90s, Stones played at the stadium. And we were at our friend's house in across University Avenue, and you could hear the whole damn thing. It was great.
Awesome. And I guess outside of UF, like, what are maybe some memories that you have, like, from your first, like, experiences living in Gainesville? Like, any, like, first impressions that you got from the city itself, like the community?
Racially divided. That, you crossed 13th Street, and Fifth Avenue was still at some level a fairly vibrant black community. And, there were some good soul restaurants there that you could go to. And they, because of the proximity to the university, it wasn't like you felt strange going in there, So, and, I went to school in Williamsburg, so people see Gainesville was a small town. Well, Gainesville was bigger and more cosmopolitan than Williamsburg was, for sure. So.
Interesting. And can I ask you more about, like, so how often did you go over to the neighborhood that would be past Fifth Avenue? Would you say, was that Porter's community, or?
No, that's the Fifth Avenue.
Fifth Avenue, okay.
Maybe we'd eat there maybe once a month or so, and not much. So.
Interesting. Okay. Let's see. Where do we want to go from there? Okay. Let's move on to Sidney Lanier.
Okay.
I love hearing you talk about it. So, what were your first experiences teaching there?
I interned in the winter quarter, because UF was on quarters, winter quarter 1976. And I interned in at this point, it was a special school only. It had been a regular elementary school, and then it was a regular elementary school with a special wing for a little while. Then it turned into just a special school for people with intellectual disabilities. And I was interning in a class of high school level kids, 16 to 21. Teaching all sorts of academics, but also vocational skills. So we established this whole, and again, I think what we did there is pretty amazing, because you read what people think that they're doing neat stuff now, and we were doing that stuff 50 years ago, which is incredible. So we had all these workshops in which we taught ceramics, we taught woodworking. We taught for really low functioning kids. We had a workshop where they practiced sorting skills and working on learning to stay at a task. And then we had another thing where we made where students made materials for other teachers. So like if a teacher needed a set of flashcards, instead of buying them, they would contract out with us, and the kids would stencil the flashcards. Then they'd laminate them, and they'd cut them and everything else, and we would get money. But the kids couldn't get paid. God forbid the kids get paid. But when the money came into this account, we took the entire kids to Disney World. So it was just kind of cool. So then I graduated in March, because winter quarter was over, graduated in March, went back up to New York and started looking for jobs. And I had a job in Mexico, New York, which is upstate, and thought about that. Thought about that, and then I got a call to come back to Gainesville, and in the same program that I was in, the principal was there and said, "We're expanding. We need another teacher," and so I came back down and never left. And so then for 6 years, I taught those guys. Doing those types of things, and I still have some of the woodworking things that we made. I got this stool that's in great shape still 50 years later, and ceramic stuff, and taught kids to read and all this other thing. And in the process, UF in the state of Florida were actually good, unlike today. If you needed to get recertified, you could either get continuing education units, or you could take classes at UF. But the classes didn't have to be associated with what you were studying. So if I wanted to take a course in astronomy, that would count. So I said, all right, let me take a course in history, go back. And on top of that, every course, if you had an intern, you had a free semester's worth of courses. Not just one class, but like as many as you wanted. So, I mean, it was a great deal. Today, they'd give you something like this, and say, thank you very much. But so it was great. So I got, and classes were, after school. And so by this time I had my bike, so I was, riding over there. And then I went back for 2 years, full-time, to get my master's in history, with the assumption that when I finished, I could go back to Lanier and teach there. And so I did that, and then did that for another X number of years, and then took some time off and finished my PhD, and then went back full-time to Sydney. And when I went back again, I started this, which you may find to be unbelievably ridiculous, this adaptive technology lab, where I was working with computers to allow students who couldn't learn by traditional means to interact with them. So, all the things that we have now really started with special needs kids. We talk about touch tone, touch screens. I had touch screens 1990 on my computers, for special needs kids. When we talk about phones that talk and everything else, I had that, and I had to install the talking devices, and it was phenomenally fascinating and wonderful, and really a great experience, because my principal was fantastic, allowing me to run this lab as opposed to having a classroom, and kids from age 5 to 21 would come in at various times of the day to learn using computer technology in a variety of ways. Some of them were direct input like we do. Some of them were using switches. Some of them were using touch screens. Some of them were using enlarged keyboards. So it was, and I would talk with the classroom teacher to talk about what the particular needs of the kids were, and so before phones had cameras, there were digital cameras, which were the transition from the regular Kodak, and so we had those before anybody else had, and so what we would do is send higher level kids out in the community to take pictures, and we download them, and then we put those pictures on a board, and okay, your job now is to find your house. This is my house, and so it was just interesting, amazing stuff.
Really interesting.
And got to do neat stuff. Got to present in Paris about that. Got a Krista McAuliffe Fellowship from the U.S. Department of Education, which doesn't exist anymore, for taking what I was doing in the lab and taking it out to other schools and to people's houses. So I'd go to people's houses and help the parents set up a computer setup for their special needs kid in their house so that they could do those kinds of things at home. So it was pretty amazing.
When you say you were then like taking a lot of those like technologies outside of the classroom to like homes and other schools, was that just within the state of Florida, or were you going outside of Florida?
No. I mean, in a lot of in the conferences that I went to, and I presented and got into this network of people who were doing this around. So although I didn't go to there, I certainly talked about that there, like, a lot of this stuff here, right? Technology and inclusion, grandparent special needs, computer learning month, all that stuff, so it was an interesting time. I got a big grant from Apple to when they first introduced Macs, because we were using old Apple IIs, which actually were really good for special needs kids. But Apple, I think, got like 5 Macintosh computers for my classroom, and utilized them, and went to conferences that Apple put on, and disseminated that information to people around the country. So it was a really kind of well thought of program, and it was very nice. And then but I was also coaching basketball, which was a whole nother thing there. So
We can talk about it, coaching basketball, if you want.
Sure, but we're not. Right. You done with talking about computers? I think maybe when I talk about UF and the making an impact on students here, people go on, it's great, but maybe the best thing, there was some kids from Eastside High School, which is who were quote unquote normally intelligent, but had severe physical impairments where they couldn't learn by traditional means, and so they had an aide with them full time. And so they would come to my lab, which is interesting. You think about sending special kids to regular classes. Here, we're sending regular kids to special classes because the computer technology that I had was better than what they had. And so I had this young man, Alan, who had muscular dystrophy and couldn't move his hands, but brain was intact. And I came over here and we developed this method for him to type on the computer, whereby there was an on-screen keyboard, which basically the regular QWERTY keyboard was on screen with sequential highlighting. And so when the box, it's called scanning, when the box scanned to what he wanted to, he hit a switch attached to his head, which was attached to the computer, and the box stopped. And then, like, say if the box had 4 letters, then it would be A, B, C, D, whatever, and then it went. So he learned to type that way, and then he put macro commands in there. Sounds like I know what I'm talking about with computers, but macro commands. So first day he was there, I set this whole thing up, and I had to learn how to do all this, and then had a macro command to print. So he typed his name and printed it, and it was like, it's amazing, So he said to the aide, he said, "I don't think I need you anymore," which was great, So he then came, and basically he got a job in my classroom, doing like input. So it wasn't just practicing. And then I had another girl named Mandy who we set up in the library doing input for library books, and we had a big keyboard, and she couldn't move her hands at all and had little control of her head, so she typed in on the keyboard, huge keyboard on her down with her foot. So this just great stuff, stuff that probably people here have no idea the kinds of stuff that we were doing there. So it was fantastic. And then I'd leave there and go coach basketball. So.
And some of those technologies that you were just talking about, have they evolved since then?
Or yes, yep. I think basically every special needs kid has access to an iPad. Every special needs kid, and the phones have changed everything. You don't need a digital camera and those intersecting steps. You can print off of this stuff. But some of the things are still there, particularly switches, which allow kids to, like one of the things we had was choice making, because the last years that I was there, I had a class of really low functioning, nonverbal, mostly wheelchair bound older children. Just tough because we had to potty them. Never a fun thing. But a lot of the things were okay, it's time for fun stuff. Listen to this music. Well, shit, they may not like that music. Right? So trying to get them using a switch to so we'd have a picture of, I don't know, Bad Bunny and a picture of Mozart, right, on a switch. And okay, what do you want? And they'd sit there and say, well, you ain't getting any music until you tell me what you want. They'd hit the Mozart switch and play classical music. You could tell the kid didn't like that. Okay, well, you made that choice. You got to listen to it. And it had a picture, and so getting them to decide, which one you want. Okay, boom, all right. And certainly with food too, the assumption with those kids, a lot of we shovel shit in their mouth. And okay, I don't like that. So, okay, what do you want? You want potatoes or you want hamburger? So I think those types of switch stuff is still there. And, like same thing with bathrooming, okay. Or to go to the bathroom, they've got to hit the switch that talks and says, I need to use the bathroom. So I think that type of really really low level technology really still works. And I think that stuff is still around.
Interesting. Thank you for that. And having the experience working with those technologies and the way that they help to provide a source of autonomy.
Yep, I think that's the thing, independence. Yep.
How has that kind of informed the way that you then approach your interpretation of disability?
Oh, I think it changes it a lot. I think that it's given me empathy much more so. It's made me realize that these individuals are not simply dependent on us, that within them they can learn if we can crack the code. And I think that's really an important thing. And technology really has changed that significantly. And that they are individual people, which is why the notion of the IEP, which is an individualized educational plan, which often has now devolved into just bureaucratic nonsense. But I think having a plan that's based upon the needs, wants, desires of students and their parents and their teachers. I've IEPs, you get into it all the time, and parents would say to me, "Well, my student needs this, and you need to." I said, "Okay, understand your job is to advocate for your child, and I appreciate that, and I understand. My job is to advocate for everybody in this room, and sometimes those things come into conflict, and I've got to figure out which is more important." So, but I think that knowing that technology will allow people to improve, and it also allows people to understand that oftentimes the blocks to learning are the impediments that we put in there. So.
Interesting. And do you see that kind of idea of meeting students where they are, as something that's kind of universal to your experience teaching?
Oh, God, yeah. I was at a conference, in a history conference in 1990 in San Francisco, the AHA, the same one I was at in New York when we went this time with my granddaughter, talking about teaching experience, the experience of a graduate student. And I said, I don't find much difference between teaching special needs kids and teaching university students. And people went crazy. I got fucking. And I said, because you need to meet students where they are. You need to understand that everybody learns, and everybody learns differently. You know, there are people who learn much better visually. There are people, and I learned that from teaching special ed. You know, and certainly, you know, when COVID was horrible, and I think we're still seeing the deleterious effects of that, particularly now from incoming freshmen who are in middle school, maybe when COVID came. So, I mean, COVID was awful, but I think COVID made me a better teacher because it allowed me to utilize different forms of teaching that maybe students learn better that way, and particularly visual learning. I just would oftentimes not use much visual beforehand, and now, you know, I'm not dependent on it, but I think it really allows students to learn in different ways.
And learning more about like finding those, cracking the code, if you will, finding those different approaches to teaching and for learning, how did that then influence the way that you took on coaching for basketball?
Well, first of all, coaching is about a lot of fun, but it's also about learning, that students learn that they can be successful. And in a classroom, oftentimes they're not successful, but they can be successful out on the court. And also learning that special needs basketball players are basketball players first and special needs people second. And, you know, when my UF students come there, I try to tell them that, you know, you ain't coaching Special Olympians, you're coaching basketball players. And I think that, you know, and they will tell you, I'm a basketball player. And certainly, I think, you know, Lanier became this basketball-obsessed place that, you know, kids, I want to play basketball, you know, and I've heard from parents that say, I hate you. Why? Because all Tony does at night is, I walk into his room and he's got this, you know, this Nerf ball thing, and he's practicing my shot, Mom. It's time to go to bed. He said, you did this to my son. You know, I mean, and I think that it allows me to, you know, some people play basketball differently, and trying to rearrange the way they play and to succeed. Like, we had people that basically couldn't run very well. So, all right, play a game, we'd sit them at one end of the court, and, you know, everybody'd be down there, and this person would be standing down there, and the other team would be shooting at the basket, and my team would get the rebound and throw it down to Anna, and Anna, or even roll it down to her, she'd boom, put it up there. I said, that's genius. I said, yep, she can't run very good, but she can shoot, you know, so, and I think towards the end, when we played in a middle school league against regular middle school kids in Alachua County, was pretty amazing for everybody. For me, it was that they could compete, not necessarily win, but all the time sometimes, but could compete against middle school kids, regular middle school kids. But the responses of those kids, you know, if we beat these, you know, sometimes their coach would get, you know, you got beat by those kids. That's great. But other coaches would say, God, wow, this is so good for my students to see how good they are, you know. So it was wonderful. And I've got a kid, and he's not a kid now, he's a grown-up, who went from that to International Special Olympics and became the, you know, the star of the international thing. In fact, he played in this thing called included games, in which regular people play on teams with special needs kids, and they went to Berlin to play in the international games. And one of my students from UF was on the team too, and three of my athletes from Lanier were on the team. You know, this guy from Lanier called me up and said, Coach, you got to work with Will. He's just not any good. And Will was the student that was here. So it was pretty funny. And my niece, who's
teaches in Collier County, and she's doing Special Olympics, and they played against this team, and they lost, and the team from Alachua County won, and she said, "Oh my God, my kids were so pissed off. They were angry and getting mad, and this one guy from Alachua County came up to him, and he was great. He's the best player I've ever seen. He came up to them and said, 'You don't need,' and I said, 'Yeah, that's my student, that's Keandre.' And so, and I told him that on the phone. He said, 'Oh my gosh, that was your niece? I didn't know that.' So that's nice. And basketball is good for dealing with for dealing with UF kids too. And I still get emails from students. You're still coaching? How's the team going? So I think for many UF students, it might have been the highlight of their time here, because it was this fun situation. These kids are just great. They work with them, and they got to see how people actually could play. And oftentimes on Saturdays, we would play against Phi Alpha Theta, the History Honor Society kids, most of whom were nerdy little girls, sorry. And to get their behind kicked by, special needs kids, oh my God, it was so wonderful. And they loved it, because the kids were, and it's also about the fact that, oh, these guys are so nice. Well, yes, maybe, but they're just like regular people. They are regular people. They get pissed off, they're not so friendly. They can say bad things, It's not just, oh, they're so, like when they had the beginnings of Special Olympics back in the mid-'70s, we'd have track and field out at UF track, and all these nice helpers would be out there, and these sorority girls, sorry, I hate to be stereotypic, but they'd be out there like this, and the kids would, these young men would be running and they'd hug them. And I said, no. Well, why not? I said, would you go up to some young man, 18 years old, out of the blue and hug them? She said, no, that's awful. I said, well, think about that. I said, they may be intellectually disabled, but they've got thoughts and feelings too that are appropriate to an 18-year-old. Oh, I said, yeah. Oh, yeah. So we don't want to do that. Okay. And I'm sorry. I said, it's okay. I said, this is a learning experience for everybody.
Interesting. Do you have any other any memories that stand out that you would like to share, that you could share with us, just from even your time just at Lanier teaching, or being a coach?
Well, I think maybe the best was we were and I got this plaque at home rather than here, but we were at regional meet at Mayport Naval Base, which is where they always were, and we were there. And the winner of this goes on to state, and I had a really good team, and we were losing badly, maybe 10 points. We were losing by 10 points with a minute to go, and I called timeout, and said, all right. And, generally, you think of coaching these guys, and I said, all right, this is what we have to do to win the game. I said, we're going to steal the ball. You're going to call timeout. We're going to steal the ball. We're going to throw it out. We're going to hit a three, and damned if they didn't do all of that, and they hit a shot at the buzzer, to win the game. And, it's amazing. These white Down syndrome kids hugging big black kids. And I had this guy who was not only intellectually disabled, he had cerebral palsy, and he was deaf, and he was on the team. And his brother was played college ball. His brother was really good. So, the father was watching the game, and he said, watching Kenneth play is even more fulfilling than watching his brother play college. And of course, we went and won state. If I don't ride my bike to school, I ride the bus, and oftentimes I'll see former players on the bus, coach, And so this one guy, Chris, every time I see him on the bus, "Hey, coach, remember that game? You told me not to shoot that ball, and I shot it, and it went in." I said, "Yes, Chris." Then he starts talking to the bus driver. "That's my coach. We won the state championship." And so it's just, and then, those are the types of things that stick with you. Then I was on the bus, and I'm there, and there's two black guys sitting there, grown-ups. And this one guy says, "Do you know me?" I said, "No." I said, "Sorry." And I know all my kids. He says, "I am Pierre." I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Wow." And he was like stick thin when I had him. He was big. So and then okay, yeah. And he's with another guy, and he says, "Yeah, this is my friend." And of course, I think he'd been in jail, And he said, "This is my friend. I'm doing good now." He says to the guy, "The only time my mother ever went up to school that I wasn't in trouble was when I played basketball for him." I said, so that's the kind of stuff that makes it kind of worthwhile. And it kind of ties in with the whole UF student stuff, because, they see this stuff, and it's great, so.
Awesome. I love hearing more about that. I love hearing more about your experiences at Sydney Lanier. And I think I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit because you've talked about keeping a lot of close relationships with colleagues and friends that you've had over the years, the meetups at First Magnitude on the weekly. Can you tell me more about the relationships you developed with your colleagues at Sydney Lanier?
That's kind of like war, right? Everybody's got war stories. My wife would come home and she'd say, "Oh, geez, you believe what happened today?" And I said, "Yeah," because she taught special ed at what was J.J. Finley, which is now Carolyn Parker Elementary. And she had kind of higher functioning students, a lot of learning disabled stuff. And our stuff was always, chasing kids down and running away and all this other stuff. So I think the bonds that we had with those people are pretty tight, and everybody's got each other's back. So it's very nice. And I think the bonds there are much tighter than the bonds here because of the relation, you're in a smaller building, everybody's there all day, every day, you share the same kids. So I think it's really nice. And everybody then was basically the same age. So, watch each other's kids grow up, babysat each other's kids, went camping together, all that kind of stuff. So now everybody's got grandkids and share those stories. So it's just nice.
Nice. And you mentioned your wife also teaching in special education. How did you two meet? Did you meet in the school system, or?
She interned for me. And she just got a card in the mail from a woman who taught there too at Lanier. And she said, "I remember Steve asking me and Susie whether it was okay for him to date you after you finished your internship." And we said yes. So I was a good boy and didn't date her while we were interning. But so, and she'll tell you that the first time she walked into my classroom and she says, "Oh, she sees this guy," and apparently I said something like, "I don't talk much to people I don't know, so don't feel like I'm dissing you." She said she thought that was interesting. So, but our kids ended up volunteering at my school too, which is just kind of amazing. So. My son won Volunteer of the Year. My wife had a Girl Scout troop, they came to Sydney every Friday afternoon and worked with some of the younger kids. So it was fun. And my son spent summers, summer school. They had a lot of people helping out there, so he would do that. So it's kind of a whole family thing. So.
And you've kind of mentioned now that between both you and your wife are teachers, and now you also have children that are teachers as well. How do you feel that maybe the things that, or at least do you hope that some of the things that you have learned in your career as a teacher have been maybe able to be passed down onto your children as they've entered that field?
Everybody learns differently, I think. And small steps are important. That content is important, but getting to work with kids where they are and moving them up is probably just as important.
Cool. All right. There's another thing I wanted to ask about. So you teach Florida history, and
Yep.
you tend to be pretty involved with things that are more kind of community history oriented. And the Marjorie Keenan Rawlings house
Yep.
is kind of a local site. And recently, I went to the Yearling restaurant.
Yep.
What is kind of the connection that you find yourself having to Rawlings works, maybe specifically the Yearling?
Really liked going out there when we first got married, because it's, rural, and the Yearling was just a great place. I remember I went there once. My wife's parents drove up from Orlando, and they're going to meet us there. My wife drove. I rode my bike out there, so which is a long ways. It was connection to a Florida that is rapidly disappearing. So, we had our first child. What the hell are we going to name them? We said, well, we're going to name him Jody, either boy or girl, androgynous, and middle name would be Baxter, which is the name of the child in the Yearling, but Baxter is also my wife's maiden name. So my son is Jody Baxter Noll, and still in his bedroom, which he and his daughter and his wife just were at this weekend because they were here. There's pictures of the Rawling house. There's a big poster of Jody Baxter from the Yearling book. There's the first day cover of the stamp from the Yearling. So the Yearling is pretty important to my connection to UF and to Florida and to this region. One of my honors students did her honors thesis on Marjorie Keenan Rawlings and cracker culture, and she was also a journalism major, and she said, I want to do a video. And of course the department kind of said, well, no, we have to have a 50-page paper. I said, well, let's see if we can do something different. Let's see if she can write a 20-page paper and do a documentary. And so she did like a 15-minute documentary on that. It was phenomenal. It was amazing. In fact, Jeffrey Giles, who was a former history professor, he was there, and he said, well, that was really a good thing. He said, no, where did she get that video? I said, well, Jeffrey, she made it. I said, oh my God, it's so wonderful. In fact, and she went to grad school, Documentary Film Institute, and now she's making documentary movies, and started again with Rawlings. So, my good friend is Flo Turcotte, who is the Rawlings archivist over at Library East, and so the connection is there still. And every time, hopefully, we went back this year, but every time I taught the second half of Florida history, we'd go out to the Rawlings house. It's great, and students love it. And actually, one time I went there, and Fox went with us, which was pretty amazing. Fox being Kent Fox, former president of UF. And so he would come to my Florida history class every year, but one year he said, can I come on the field trip? I said, sure. And he came without an entourage. He didn't come with his handlers or anybody else, just him. He drove himself out there, and it was just great. But students love it.
Awesome. And I guess to talk a little more about UF, maybe some of the changes that you've seen. We're here with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, but you had some experience with the program yourself. And
I took a class with Sam.
Yes.
Yeah, I took a class with Sam, and the first interview I did was with my father-in-law, and I thought it was great because my father-in-law doesn't talk. Proctor eviscerated me. This guy's not saying a damn thing. What are you doing? I said, "You don't understand, Sam." I said, "This is the most I've heard him talk ever. You know, this is great." And Sam was this wonderful guy, but also pretty irascible. I got to be involved with the Proctor Institute from the beginning. And Julian was a good friend of mine too. I played basketball with him, and then Paul was a good friend. So, I kind of knew all the people. In fact, Proctor lived right across the street from my really good friend, and we went swimming in his pool with him and Bessie, who was just the sweetest, nicest person. So, lots of connections for long times.
And how have you seen the program change from your first experiences, like as a student of it, to
Well,
now?
I think one way it's changed is that, Proctor saw his role as a, besides his Indian stuff, Proctor saw his role as interviewing and kind of important figures. People, and I think one thing, I think Paul was great, but I think Paul kind of lost that. I think you get a different view of important figures when you interview them as opposed to when you read their archival materials. And so, I think Paul really flipped the switch to, and again, Dave Tegeter, who is my co-author, his mom just died, and I was at her funeral, and the officiant had this great term, which I think is so appropriate for the Proctor Institute. She was an extraordinary, ordinary person. And that just hit me, and it was, wow. And, as soon as it was, and Dave gave his talk, and it was great, but as soon as it was over, I said to Dave, that's the greatest thing that anybody could be called. And I think Paul was really good at finding the extraordinary in ordinary people. And I think that's the big difference I find in the way that the oral history program works. That said, I think trying to find extraordinary in extraordinary people is wonderful too. And I think that, when talking to Bob Graham, you'll learn a lot about that extraordinary man by interviewing him that you wouldn't get out of those notebooks.
I'm sorry. Anyway, okay. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Did you ever meet Bob Graham?
Oh, yeah. Bob Graham came to talk to my Florida history class, too, all the time. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little about him?
Buttoned-down, uptight guy. But coming to my class, he would say, "What do you want me to talk about?" And I said, "Whatever the hell you want to talk about." And, sometimes he would ask questions of students or answer questions from students. Sometimes he would talk about his father, Ernest Cap Graham, who was a Florida state legislator who was involved in removing the poll tax, and talked about that experience. He was a good and decent man who I think, particularly, when he talked about those work days that he did, he really got into that. It wasn't just window dressing. Oh, let's go out and be a bus driver for an hour. He would drive the bus all day, and he would talk to the bus driver and talk to the passengers. He was a pretty amazing guy as far as and cared about people. I think a funny story. I was out to dinner at a restaurant now non-existent and out by Thornbrook, and we're waiting for a table, and Bob and Adele, his wife, were coming out. They had just finished, and my friend says, "I know that guy. Who is that guy? Who is that guy?" And I I introduced him. I said, "This is Bob Graham," and he said, "Oh, Steve, how are you?" And it was their anniversary, and all of a sudden he went in from being Bob Graham friend to being Bob Graham what's your friend's name? Oh, hi, nice to meet you. What do you do? And it was so amazing. It was wonderful, and I've gotten to know Adele since since Bob had his stroke more, and since Bob's passing, and she's just a wonderful person, just great. Know the family somewhat, and I got to, through the book up there, writing for the public good, I got to know them pretty well.
Awesome. Do you have any stories you would want to share about that?
Read the book. Pay money buy the book. No, I don't got to take damn stories. No, I mean he just. No, I mean it just. For such an organized guy, and he's trying to put the articles together was just kind of a pain, because they, he and David Colburn, they cut out articles from the newspaper and put them in. What papers are they from? What day are they from? That. So, it's sort of surprising from this guy who saved everything, and stuff was just kind of thrown around. And so I remember getting all this stuff, and David Colburn's daughter is the speech therapist at Lanier now. And she said, I got all this stuff for the book from my dad, and I was at Lanier for basketball. And I said, well, we'll have to do something different because it's a big box. I said, I can't carry it on my bike because every time I had basketball, it was on every Wednesday afternoon, I would teach my class and then ride my bike to Lanier, but I could. So Margaret brought all this. It was pouring rain, and she brought this box of stuff and gave it to me, and that was, I had to try and figure out how to make sense of this stuff to turn into the book. And then, of course, COVID happened, which made things even more problematic. So, and when I was talking to the people from the Florida Press, and brought the thing over there, and it was like something out of All the President's Men with Nixon. She came out of the building, which is on the East Campus, masked up, and I was masked up, and we're on this sidewalk, and she would. And this one, the assumption was COVID was passed, and so she passed the box of materials on the sidewalk to me, and I was here, and I have to, and she'd step back. It was kind of surreal.
Interesting.
So that's all I got.
That's all I got. Well, I guess I've actually started to exhaust a lot of my questions, but I do have one kind of final note that we can maybe try to tie it up with. But so you've been in Gainesville for a while, since you've been in your master's up until now as a professor. Yeah. And in light of a lot of the recent changes that the university's been going through as far as faculty and changes in leadership and things like that, from the changes that you've seen happen in the university since you first got here up until now, how do you see the campus kind of moving forward as it goes through these changes from what you've just experienced being here over the years?
Well, I think one thing is that in spite of all the changes, the constant is young people coming here. Young people coming here to learn, young people coming here to party, young people coming here to play sports. That hadn't changed. Maybe the atmosphere of classrooms have changed, but that hadn't changed at all. And I think that's pretty interesting. And people say, well, how different are students? They're not that much different than, maybe the hair's different, but and all the nonsense that's going on with changes in administration, with government mandates at both the federal and state level, at some point, you have to realize how little that affects individual students on a daily basis. It may affect what they want to study, which is just horrific, and it may affect the fact that they cannot write grants on particular things. But within the history department, I think things have kind of remained constant in spite of all the nonsense that's out there. And for me, what I focus on is daily student interaction. I try not to think about the broader nonsense that's going on, because it's nonsense. And so try to just deal with that.
Thank you for that. I guess for us to wrap up, is there any other final remarks that you want to bring up or anything that I haven't asked you that you'd like to touch on?
No, I think that, Gainesville's been my home, and I bitch about all those people who say, ask them where they're from. Oh, I'm a New Yorker, and I can still think about that I'm a New Yorker, but actually I've been in Gainesville for, 51 years. That's longer than most people have been in Florida. And I've seen a lot of the changes, mostly negative, that have taken place. But, this is my home, and it's been really good. My wife and I have made a great life for ourselves. The kids are connected to Gainesville, and even though they no longer live here. And I think that's, in spite of all the nonsense, you try to focus on the positive, because if not, you just end up blowing your head off, right? So that's what I try to do.
Well, all right. Thank you, Dr. Noll.
And take the gun so I don't blow my head off.
That's a good way to end it.
That's a good way to end it. To end with my boys here.
Yeah, of course.
So
Show us your friends.
We didn't touch at all upon maybe the best part of the UF experiences, the summer programs that I ran with Sophia Akert from the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere for high school students, and for K through 12 teachers for 5 years in the last decade, focusing on Florida and water. And this is our mascot. This is Hugh Manatee with his Humanity in the Sunshine State. So I've become as obsessed with manatees as I am with disability history. This is Valdez, who is the mascot of the Phi Alpha Theta, and I'll end with his story. We had a creek cleanup in Gainesville, and here we were with Phi Alpha Theta students, and we were getting rid of liquor bottles and detritus and all this crap, and this guy comes digging out of the mud, and I said, all right, let's throw. Oh, doctor, no, you can't throw him away. You can't. You have to save him. So, of course, my wife and I washed him and blew dry him and put Dawn detergent on him, kind of like what you do with real life manatees. And found out that in spite of all that, he still squeaks, which is amazing. And, well, what are we going to name him? Well, this was before the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf. And so the only oil spill that they knew was the Valdez oil spill in Alaska. So that's his name, Valdez. And, we're the only Phi Alpha Theta chapter in the nation that has our own mascot, and our own mascot that has its own Phi Alpha Theta story. So I think it's great.
Thank you for that story. I didn't know that.
That's a good way to end.
That's a great way to end.
All right. Thank
you.
you.